Right. So hello, everyone. Again, as you can see on the screen, please feel free to share your name, your location, and any other information that you'd like to share in the chat. We are going to go ahead and officially get started. I'm going to briefly introduce myself or reintroduce myself if you've been here or watched session 1. But in case this is the first time that you're joining live, my name is Lee Bittler, and I am the Director of Professional Learning and a Structured Literacy Coach at the Stern Center for Language Learning. This is my 14th year in education. I've spent 10 years as a classroom teacher. I have the dual certification in general ed and special education, and I'm heading into my 5th year as a literacy coach. I've been at the Stern Center now for going into my 2nd year, and the Stern Center for Language and Learning is a nonprofit learning center based in Vermont, and we are dedicated to helping children and adults reach their academic, social, and professional goals. It's located in Williston, Vermont, and services include evaluation, instruction, social communication and learning, and professional learning. And we are also the site of the Vermont chapter of the Reading League. So I'm excited to be here with you all today. I see that people are joining from all over the United States. I see some Alabama, Ohio, Florida, Connecticut, Washington State, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. Welcome to everyone. Even though the Stern Center is based in Vermont, I'm actually in central New York. So I am located there. And I'm excited again to be here with you all today. We are going to take a look now at the materials that we need and the agenda before we actually begin digging in. The materials that you'll need today, same as last time. So something to write on, something to write with, the text itself, and the book study guide. I'm going to drop that book study guide link into the chat just in case you need it. Some housekeeping items. You will be eligible to receive a certificate of attendance for all sessions that you attend live. Your participation in the entire course of sessions will count towards certificate hours, and there will be a form to fill out at the end of each session that I'll cross-reference with the electronic record that we get through Zoom. And so at the end of the series, you can expect to receive a certificate with that total number of hours. Some other logistics, please feel free to keep your microphone muted unless you'd like to share something. You can jump in at any time with questions, thoughts, connections that come to you as we move through our time together this afternoon. You can certainly use that hand function on Zoom to raise your virtual hand if you'd like, because it's a little bit easier to see rather than your physical hand, and I'll call on you. But also feel free to come off mute and jump in if you have something to add or a question to ask. You can also feel free to utilize that chat function as well. So chatting something to everyone in terms of connection or a thought that you had or a question will definitely benefit us all. After today's session ends, tomorrow most likely you'll receive the recording of today's session, the slide deck, and the resource document for further exploration. And I'll send that out via email. So if you don't see that tomorrow, by the end of the day, let me know. Our agenda for today and our objective for today's session is we're going to really bookend our time together with some connections to practice. First, I'm going to ask for some stories and experiences from some of you that relate to today's content. And at the end of our time together today, we'll consider some different activities that we'd like to incorporate into our practice as well. After our initial share, we're going to dig into chapter 3, learn more about what that blueprint for reading comprehension is, and explore exactly what it's suggesting that we consider as educators. We'll then turn our attention to chapter 4, vocabulary instruction, and then chapter 5, syntax and sentence comprehension instruction. And we'll finish our time together by reflecting on some evidence-based practices that we'd like to incorporate into our upcoming instruction. Our objective for today's session is to understand the components of and how to use the reading comprehension blueprint, to deepen our understanding of the importance of vocabulary, syntax, and sentence comprehension, and plan for evidence-based activities in the classroom or supporting teachers in doing that. So I'd like to start off with sharing some connections to our practice. I'm going to ask you to think of things that come to mind. So as you read chapters 3, 4, and 5, what connections were you making to your own experiences as an educator or as an administrator or support for teachers? Feel free to think about a story or experience that relates to the content of chapters 3, 4, or 5. I'm going to pause here for about 2 minutes so that you can think of something that maybe stands out to you. And then after those 2 minutes are up, I'll ask you to raise your virtual hand and share some of those stories, experiences, anecdotes that came to you with everyone. I think it's important to share our personal experiences and connections to practice. So I'll be quiet for about 2 minutes while you think of something that comes to mind and how it relates to the content of chapters 3, 4, and 5, and then we'll share out. About 10 seconds and finish thinking or jotting things down if you were doing that. And would anyone like to share something that came to your mind and considered a connection to practice between those chapters and your personal experiences? Elizabeth?
I can share something. So I think chapter 5 in general is the one that I've been most excited about so far, and definitely the most heavily annotated for me. It talks about syntax and sentence level comprehension. And I think one of the reasons I'm so excited about it is because I could make so many connections between what Nancy Hennessy is talking about in terms of the impact that sentence level understanding has on general text comprehension, and connecting that with my teaching of middle school students. And I think this area is probably where my practice strayed farthest from what she's talking about in terms of effective grammar instruction. I taught grammar in isolation. We spent a lot of time on parts of speech, some time on sentence structure, but it was very sort of old school in terms of these are what nouns are, these are what adjectives are, instead of looking at the function that that particular word played in context or in the context of the sentence. And so, I regret those 6 years that I spent teaching middle schoolers in that way. But since, learning a little bit more about this, I've seen the impact that some really simple targeted grammar instruction can have on student writing, particularly. And I wish, just in terms of like teaching about adverbial phrases and prepositional phrases and using those to enhance, the detail with which a student writes. And I wish that I had made this connection on my own about how that writing focused instruction can translate to stronger comprehension when students understand the function of individual words or of phrases in within a text. So a lot of aha moments for me. And if I get back in the classroom or I'm even working with students one-on-one in the future again, I think I'll definitely approach this area much differently and with renewed vigor.
Thank you so much for sharing, Elizabeth. As a former 6th grade teacher, that definitely resonates with me, everything that you said, thinking about the ways in which I was teaching and the ways in which I would change that teaching now is definitely powerful. So thank you for sharing. Would anyone else like to share? Diana? Oh, I'm sorry, Diana, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Elizabeth said, because it brought to the forefront the importance of syntax. And even as a speech pathologist, we talk about that a lot. But for the teachers, this really, the way the chapter is written is like, guys, you have to read this chapter because it like spells it out for you, the importance. I'm just so excited for it. Degree of meaning when they are talking about vocabulary, I live there, and my language impaired students really enjoy doing those tasks. And that's the quickest way I've found to bridge their connection, to try and get that academic vocabulary quicker and put it into a more usable framework for them, because sometimes visually lining the words out helps them remember better. And students with autism, they like things spelled out for them to make those connections. So we also have those students at school, and it works out great. The parts of speech, I didn't realize how important pronouns were in 2nd grade. And the students were getting lost in who was talking, he, she, well, what does that referent mean? Who are they talking about? So just bringing that point up to the teachers helps them make those connections too. And the morphology, the more and more I get into it, morphology is just that critical piece in the older grades, 4th and 5th, getting them prepped, ready for middle school. The morphology magic is something that's a workbook with nice visuals to use. And the writing connections, the writing rope, the new text that's out is so practical for making the connections with syntax and the application for teachers in other graphic organizers and things like that I found helpful for my teachers.
Thank you so much, Diana. I also resonated with that book that you just referenced, The Writing Rope by Joan Sedita. It's really excellent and helps break down all of the factors that go into skilled writing, just like Scarborough's Reading Rope breaks down all the factors that go into skilled reading. So if you are interested in learning more about that, I definitely recommend that text, and I can drop that name in the chat so that you can save it or reference it. And I love that your students are really responding well to that shades of meaning exercise in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons. I think it's very powerful and can generate some really interesting discussion. So thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else who would like to share? This will not be your only opportunity to share if you would like. Please feel free to put thoughts or connections into the chat, and we will continue to weave in our personal experiences and connections throughout tonight's session as well, and wrap up with some of the same. So definitely keep making those connections as we continue on tonight. Thank you again, Diana and Elizabeth, for sharing. We are going to next consider the actual blueprint itself. So we're going to focus on chapter 3 for a little bit. And I'm going to ask you if you could define or list out in bullets what the blueprint for comprehension instruction actually is. That would be a nice way to start off our time together today. So just on a piece of paper, jot down a quick definition or some bulleted ideas that really describe the main ideas of Nancy Hennessy's blueprint for comprehension instruction. I'll set a timer for 3 minutes, and then we'll compare and contrast what you wrote to the next slide. About 15 more seconds. Okay, so if you could pause where you are, we're going to take a look at some bullets on the next slide that will break down the blueprint for comprehension instruction, and please feel free to add to your own notes or make any adjustments as you'd like. So the blueprint, according to Nancy Hennessy, the blueprint for comprehension instruction is a master plan that's grounded in science and evidence-based practices that address both process and product demands. It's a method for organization and for scaffolding how teachers prepare to use a text in a variety of ways. It's not a lesson plan. It's a way to look at and consider the bigger picture of instruction. It's flexible in nature based on the considerations of the text, task, students, and context. It's a call for the use of specific evidence-informed strategies and activities for process and product. And it's an acknowledgement of the metacognitive nature of teaching by providing questions for us as educators to reflect upon and answer as we are conceptualizing our lesson. You can find this blueprint itself on page 44 of your text. I'm also going to put a PDF version in the chat in case you'd like to reference that. I'm going to dig into this blueprint a little more deeply. And so I know that we've seen this blueprint, we've read about it, we've probably read it a few times in this text. We can see here that there is a lot going on. And so we're going to break it down a little bit further. On the left-hand side of the blueprint, we have some topics that need to be addressed as we prepare for instruction and as we begin planning the structure of our lesson. On the right-hand side are questions that relate to the topics on the left hand. As educators and as we're developing our lessons and deciding on what text we're going to use and why, we should be asking ourselves all of these questions as we think through the sort of master plan that we have. At the top, we have two elements that we want to consider as we prepare for our instruction. We have critical understandings of the text, and we have the purpose for reading. Why are we choosing this particular text? What is the purpose that we've set for our students? And what will be the outcomes of their learning as they engage with the text? Underneath those two, at the top, we have those considerations for text reading. And those are very similar to the strands of Scarborough's reading rope, which we looked at during our first session together. And lastly, we see those bidirectional arrows, and those are labeled before, during, and after reading strategies and activities, and comprehension monitoring. And this arrow and those labels really remind us that our instruction needs to be grounded in structured literacy practices. It needs to be explicit, systematic, direct, and scaffolded. And it reminds us that we can and should be flexible in how we're instructing students based on their needs. We can instruct students whole group, small group, or even individually based on what their needs are, and our instruction should always be centered on evidence-based instructional routines, strategies, and activities. And we'll explore more of these as we continue on today and in future sessions. Nancy Hennessy adds a lot of those evidence-based strategies and activities in each chapter, and it's really a wealth of tools that we can add to our existing toolkits. All of these different levels of language work independently, but they also work interactively. Sometimes we do develop them independently, but we know that all of these work together in concert to really contribute to the overall understanding of a text. And so when we prepare to use this blueprint, we really want to consider the critical understandings up at the top. What do we want our students to know and understand after reading the text? What are those big, enduring ideas that we want them to walk away from and understand? We also always want to make sure that we're setting that purpose for reading. What are our content goals and objectives? What are our literacy skills goals and objectives? And finally, we need to think about what readings and texts are best going to serve that purpose that we've identified, so that all works together as sort of a set of nesting dolls. And so working through this blueprint for comprehension instruction, again, it's not necessarily a format for a lesson plan, and it might not be something that we need to make sure that a specific text is hitting each one of these various rows and categories, but instead we need to be very clear about those macro levels of planning and teaching, starting with those first two areas at the top and then considering the others as well. And I really like this idea of the blueprint for comprehension instruction, because that blueprint then can turn into, we're extending that metaphor a little bit, turning into a house of comprehension. And so our goal with this reading comprehension blueprint is to really use it so that we can plan our instruction and scaffold our teaching so well that our students are able to construct and erect this reading comprehension house. And so in this house, our students have built that solid foundation of critical understandings and comprehension monitoring, which really forms that foundation or the bedrock for the rest of the structure. Then understanding and being able to construct meaning from sentences, vocabulary, background knowledge, text structures, and levels of understanding and inferencing are all of those load-bearing walls of the house, keeping the rest of the structure up. And then the roof is the expression of understanding of reading comprehension. Those ultimate goals for our students to be able to make meaning from what they've read, synthesize what they've learned with prior knowledge, and create enduring understandings that have shifted the ways in which they think. So all of those components of the blueprint will enable our students to erect these structures with each text that they read, so long as we're appropriately planning for and executing our lessons according to those elements of the blueprint. And so I like thinking about not only the blueprint itself, but then this ultimate, the extension of the metaphor, using this house to really drive those ideas home. Before we move into our next piece of today, does anyone have any thoughts or questions or connections about the blueprint itself, or even this house drawing that we have on the screen? Elizabeth?
Just hearing you talk about the house metaphor, I think in addition to the levels of understanding that these things support, we can also think about the way that they apply to the different levels of language. So all of these, most of these apply to understanding at the word level, at the phrase and clause level, sentence level, and then, you know, longer text as well. But I just made that connection as you were talking.
For sure, yeah, I love that. I love thinking about those more discrete pieces of language that we're helping our students where they are currently at, and then having that plan in place to move them forward so that they're eventually able to move from that word level to the text level and all of those places in between. Thank you, Elizabeth. Other thoughts? Now that we've established sort of this basic understanding of the blueprint, we're going to head into breakout rooms to discuss this more in depth. And so I'm going to drop the breakout room document into the chat. You can open that up, and it has some of the same protocols from the last time if you were here. So an introductory protocol so that you are familiar with everyone else in your breakout room. And then there's a variety of questions. And I'm going to ask you to take about 3 minutes, look over those directions, look over those prompts, think about which questions maybe you would like to speak to or focus on, and any initial thoughts that surface. If you have any questions, please feel free to, again, share those. I'm sure other people will have the same questions that you do. You can do so by raising your hand, coming up mute, or putting them in the chat. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to look that document over, and then we'll move into breakout rooms. about 20 seconds to finish up. Any questions or thoughts before we move into breakout room? I'm going to open up the rooms. We'll be in these rooms for 18 minutes. There will be about 4 to 5 people in each room, and I'll end those rooms with a 60-second countdown before we come back together in the main session. If you need anything or you want me to pop into your room, please use the Ask for Help button and I'll be flagged and come right in. All right, I'm going to open up the rooms and I'll see you back in 18 minutes. Welcome back to the breakout rooms. Everyone will be back in about 12 seconds. About 5 seconds before everyone returns. Right. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that your time in your breakout rooms was beneficial. I always enjoy those breakout room moments when I'm doing book studies, so I appreciate you engaging with that. Any thoughts or questions or ideas that you discussed in your breakout rooms that you'd like to share with the whole group? Terry, did you want to
Yeah,
share?
I'm gonna.
Yeah.
We talked about how so often we focus on the bottom part of that reading rope with the phonics and all that, that a lot of times we forget, and even at the little kids level, to get to that top part. I know I told him that I have CKLA in my school. I'm a fourth grade teacher, and last year we was really intentional on building the vocabulary. This year I'm gonna try to be more intentional on doing the language structures, such as the sentence structure and all that. And the one lady that was in there, they have CKLA for their district. And I told her that for our writing, we would pick out some of the vocab and have the kids implement that in their writing aspect to try to get them more into using the vocabulary that they're seeing in our English classes.
That's great. I love that strategy. Thanks so much for sharing, Terry. It's nice to be able to take this time over the summer and think about what we're going to do in the upcoming year with our students and things that we can implement. It's always a nice way to head into the next year. Elizabeth, I saw that you had your hand raised. Do you want to say something?
I was just going to say something if no one else did, but I'll say something anyway. Our group was talking about something similar to what Terry just mentioned, and it was, keeping all of these things in mind and finding the time to address all of them. It can just feel like such a time crunch, spending an adequate amount of time before, during, and after reading to support comprehension. But I like that one example of just how to incorporate vocabulary into, other content areas, or vice versa, taking some of the content area, the content from a science class or a history class, and using that content to support some of these skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really powerful way to incorporate that vocabulary in writing and comprehension. And I do think, like you're saying, and I'm sure a lot of people's breakout rooms touched on this as well, that there is so much, and we do feel that pressure of time. And yet I think that we know that focusing on at least a few of these elements to start with, and then building on as we become more and more comfortable and adept at incorporating some of these evidence-based strategies and using this blueprint as a framework for planning, I think can seem daunting at first, but definitely I think become more and more doable as we continue to use it with text in our instruction and with supporting our teachers. But I definitely sympathize. I know that it's a lot and we have little time to do a lot in. Other thoughts or questions? Well, thank you for sharing. We are going to take a look next at chapter 4 and 5. So we're going to begin digging a little bit deeper into vocabulary and language structures. And so when we think about both of these components, we are not only considering everything that we already know and do in terms of teaching vocabulary and language structures, but we're also considering the questions that we see in these 2 rows of that blueprint. This quote can be found on page 61, and I'll be silent for a minute while you read this to yourself. So that second half of this quote sticks out to me and is on my mind quite frequently, thinking about the fact that we need to know 90 to 95% of the words at minimum to truly comprehend what it is that we're reading. And Nancy reminds us that we can't assume that students come to print and come to our classrooms with the vocabulary needed to build comprehension. And we know those factors are only exacerbated by the topic and complexities of the text that we are using with our students. We know that we can use read alouds to expose our students to language and vocabulary that they might not otherwise hear in daily life. And eventually, as students read more and are exposed to more and more of a variety of texts, they'll be able to learn many new words through that act of reading and deepen their existing vocabulary knowledge. We, as educators, need to understand that nature of word meaning, how word meaning connects to comprehension, and how we can effectively teach vocabulary. We're not going to spend a lot of time tonight on the definition of vocabulary, which Nancy writes about on pages 58 through 60. The key thing I want to pull out from that section is that words are not isolated units of language, but fit into many interlocking systems and levels. Because of this, there are many particular things to know about words and many degrees of knowing. She writes that on page 59. In other words, word meanings are themselves multidimensional. Instead of focusing on those specifics of vocabulary and the various definitions of vocabulary, I want to instead focus our attention on how vocabulary impacts comprehension and what we can do as educators to make sure that we're incorporating evidence-based vocabulary strategies into our instruction. So Nancy outlines the fuzzy problem space of choosing 10 to 15 words per week to explicitly and directly teach in depth to students. And so she's provided this breakdown, and this will be included in that resource document I'll share at the end of our time together today. So you have this capture, it's not exactly from the text. I'll give you about a minute to look this over, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth. So when we are choosing those 10 to 15 words per week that we really want to explicitly and directly teach our students in depth, we can consider these questions. Is the word critical to understanding the text at hand and a variety of levels of understanding that text? Is this word or are these words providing accessibility to the text? Is it a general purpose word that will be encountered in academic tests in a variety of content areas? Does it have enduring importance? Is it something that they're going to see again and again throughout their lives and as their careers as students? Does this word support growing or generate word learning through things like morphemes, semantic relationships, and relatives? And is it a word that has multiple meanings that we can then help students really map into their lexicons? And so when we're considering these questions, help us choose which words we're going to explicitly teach our students throughout the course of a day or the course of a week, we can begin to choose words that are the most impactful. And the words themselves should be coming from the text that we're using at hand. What words are the students going to need to absolutely know before they can really make meaning of the text? And so I'm going to ask you to consider how this aligns with your current practices and past practices. And if you are supporting teachers, how does this framework align to the practices that your colleagues and the teachers that you support are utilizing in their own lesson planning and instruction? And so do those vocabulary words that you or your colleagues are choosing to directly instruct meet these criteria? If not, how are words chosen? And what might you do to shift practice to fit within this breakdown? So I'm going to pause here for about 3 minutes while you consider those questions and jot down some notes. And then we can share out. About 20 seconds to finish up. And would anyone like to share anything that came to mind as you considered these questions and the questions in the upper right corner? As Nancy writes on page 64, it's important to recognize that no one approach is going to be perfect. Teachers often have to contend with curriculum demands, and decisions should ultimately be informed by knowledge of meaningful criteria, student needs, and academic demands of curriculum, including text and past. So all of these components are things that we should consider as we are choosing those words or helping our colleagues and teachers who support to choose words. We're going to take a look next at the ways in which she breaks down the types of vocabulary instruction that we can provide our students. So she outlines a variety of different types of instruction throughout this chapter, and I've included the page breakdown here just for easy reference. As I was reading this fourth chapter and looking at all of these different subheadings, I wanted something that was a little bit more laid out for myself as I began conceptualizing the different ways in which we can instruct our students with vocabulary and evidence-based strategies. And so, again, you'll be getting this slide deck, so don't feel like you have to necessarily write this down or anything like that. But I liked this breakdown so that we can quickly refer to these various instructional methods. She outlines a simple instructional routine, a complex instructional routine, some incidental on-purpose instruction, some independent word learning strategies, and some word consciousness strategies that we can use. We're going to mainly focus on this first routine, this simple instructional routine, during our time together today. And so this simple instructional routine is something that I wanted to focus on because it's something that many of us can begin incorporating, even if we don't already, or if we don't already, I should say. And so this simple routine is fleshed out more in detail on pages 65 and 66 in the text, and in tables 4.3 to 4.4 on page 66. And so we can briefly take a look at those pages. So if you're not already open to page 66, suggest flipping open to that page and just taking a look at those tables and thinking about all of the components on this slide. So when we think about a simple vocabulary routine, we're going to first have students listen. So the teacher is going to say the target word and then discuss the structure. Students are then going to repeat that word back by saying that word aloud, and they can do this in unison. The teacher is then going to define that word in a student-friendly definition with everyday language. The teacher is then going to use that word. They're going to provide an example and then have students provide an example. And then the teacher is going to write the word. The students are going to say and write that word. And then there's going to be some discussion of the structure and parts of speech of that word. And so in this simple vocabulary routine, we're combining and really helping our students to not only think about the sounds of the word or the phonology, thinking about the spelling structure of the word or the orthography, and the meaning of the word or morphology. And so we're really getting 3 layers of language in just this simple vocabulary routine. And so one of the key ideas here is that we want students to orally repeat the word multiple times and really become involved with making meaning of that word by giving examples or by responding to examples that we give. We might give some examples, we might give some non-examples, and prompt our students to give a thumbs up if that example meets the definition of the word, or a thumbs down if that example does not meet the definition of the word, for example. And so through this routine, again, we're really targeting those multiple layers of language and allowing students to get multiple exposures to this word. One thing to note with this vocabulary routine is that multiple exposures are necessary for acquisition and application of word meaning, typically between 15 to 20 different exposures, or students using and hearing that word 15 to 20 times. And sometimes, depending on the learning profiles of our students, they're going to need more than those 15 to 20 exposures before they really deeply map that word into their lexicons. This simple routine alone is not enough to really develop the depth of knowledge that students need. We need to ensure that we're incrementally building word knowledge, allowing students opportunities to revisit words, and that we are using relevant multisensory activities for our students so that they can deeply understand and store new word meanings. Thoughts, questions, or connections about this simple vocabulary?
This reminds me a lot of Anita Archer's vocabulary routines. I was like, oh, the only thing it kind of didn't use was like the picture cue. And I do think that's important for especially our students with lower vocabulary or even our EL learners.
Yeah, it reminds me so much of her work as well. And I love that idea of supplementing using an image and, as necessary, a gesture too. So if it's a word that we could easily attach a gesture to, I think that's another great addition for many of our students. Thank you. Other thoughts? Next, we're going to take a look at the instructional roadmap that Nancy includes on page 74. And so on page 74, we see this instructional roadmap for vocabulary instruction. I'm going to ask you to just reflect on this roadmap in about a minute or two and think about which elements of this roadmap are familiar and are present in your instruction and or the instruction of your colleagues and teachers that you may support. And how often are these elements included in your instruction? If these elements are not yet included, how might you begin to incorporate some of these pieces in your own instruction? And how would using this roadmap impact your students? And so we're just going to consider this for about 2 minutes. So you can go ahead and look at this on page 74 and jot down some ideas. About 10 more seconds. Would anyone like to share anything about this roadmap or vocabulary instruction in general? Elizabeth?
I think when students start to have the opportunity to take a foreign language, if they do, like in middle school maybe, they can learn a lot of strategies for learning vocabulary. And so I think that foreign language teachers can also be a good resource for teachers in other areas to figure out different engaging ways to teach new vocabulary and for students to begin to incorporate it into their spoken and written language.
Love that idea of collaborating with a foreign language teacher to work on some new ideas for teaching vocabulary. I also like that this roadmap has a little bit of a lot of information so that we can sort of use this, maybe make a photocopy of it and keep it somewhere handy so that as we're thinking about vocabulary instruction in our lessons, we can quickly look at this and consider what pieces are we going to include. Next, we're going to turn our attention to chapter 5, which is the blueprint for sentence and syntax comprehension. So we're going to just dig right in by thinking about how we define both of those terms. And so when we think about what a sentence is and what syntax is, a sentence is a complete thought and consists of a subject and predicate. We know that. We can also think about sentences linguistically. And as Louisa Moats and Nancy Hennessy wrote in the second edition of Letters in 2011, a sentence is an abstract linguistic frame that has slots for categories of words and phrases. We know that sentences convey meaning through different parts of speech, phrases, and clauses, and that sentences are really vehicles for conveying meaning. They're the building blocks of text and may not be as simply understood as we might take for granted or we might think, as we see detailed in chapter 5. Students need to not only understand the meaning of individual words, but they also need to understand the arrangement of those words in sentences and how the arrangement really adds to the meaning. Then syntax is the grammatical and structural basis of our written language. And this includes how words combine into phrases, clauses, and sentences, the internal structures of a sentence, the ways in which word order assists in the transfer of meaning from one mind to another in writing, and the basic rules for comprehension of sentences. And then lastly, how we can arrange words into sentences and phrases. So as Nancy points out, it's important for us as educators to have this information so that we are then as informed as we can be heading into our instruction. On page 90, Nancy writes that the sentence-attuned educator understands the contributions of parts of speech, phrases, clauses, and different types of sentences, the overall meaning of the text, and of course, understands connections to effective approaches to instruction. And so we can consider the ways in which we are indirectly and directly teaching students sentences and syntax. We know that, of course, students need to know those meanings of individual words, but they also need to understand the construction and word choice within phrases, clauses, and sentences, and how those ultimately contribute to the meaning of not only that sentence, but to a paragraph and then to a larger text. So these are some of the ways in which we can include some incidental on purpose or indirect instruction into our classrooms, and some intentional on purpose or direct instructional methods into our classrooms. So we're going to move into breakout rooms for a shorter period now, and we're going to consider chapter 5. And so I'm going to put this document into the chat that has some different questions that you might want to consider. Again, the questions that are highlighted in blue are from that study guide. There are some others as well. So please feel free to discuss anything that you would most like to in your breakout rooms. We're only going to spend about 10 minutes in this breakout room. So be just for the sake of time. And as you have those discussions with your partners, think about pieces that you'd like to share out whole group so that we can spread our learning and our discussion that I know are happening in breakout rooms to our entire crowd tonight. So open that Google Doc if you haven't already. I'm going to move us into the same breakout rooms that we were in previously. And I will give you that 60-second countdown at the end of those 10 minutes so that you can wrap up your conversations and head back to our whole group. Before we move into rooms, are there any questions? Okay. Happy discussing. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back. I know that there's a lot to talk about and only a little time to talk. So I'm sure that you had some fast-paced, jam-packed discussions in your breakout rooms. Would anyone like to share something that you talked about, whether it was an idea or a connection or a question with the whole group?
I'll share.
Yeah.
So we talked about in our group, because one of the questions was actually how do you take breaking down the complex sentences and so forth, and actually, using this type of instruction in your classroom, and how often would you do it? And so being a regional support person for Region 5, one of the ways that we've been able to tie it in is using the complex sentence builders from letters, and teaching, first of all, to explain to the students the importance of the sentences and how they do add to the comprehension component of it. So once they learn the who and the do, and then they build from the who and the do, and going to the complex sentences, teaching students how to do that over a period of time, and then going back to that text to make sure that they understand that I'm using this strategy to help me in that comprehension component. They learn how to do it on their own when they get to complex text. But we talked about, how do you balance how much to do this? And so one of the things is it's just not picking any sentence, but making sure you're choosing one of those sentences that is complex, but it, connects to either that vocabulary component or the comprehension down the road, but not just one of those sentences that, they might struggle with anyway. So I think that helps, going back to the blueprint of you being intentional about, the language structures and the different pieces that you're using. But we're seeing that is helping to build word knowledge, not only that, building comprehension strategies that students know how to do throughout the text, whether it's science, social studies, or just them reading nonfiction text or any other genre text.
I love that. I think that's so powerful. You think those sentence builders, really breaking apart those sentences, intentionally modeling that for students and thinking aloud how we do that, and then having students do that work is incredibly powerful. And I love that you brought up that intentionality that we need to make sure that we're choosing sentences that really fit that mold and are going to be of importance later on. So really thinking about those comprehension needs and strategies that we can use. And then ultimately, I'm sure those sentence builders will only help students in their writing as well. So helping infuse and strengthen their current writing abilities as well. So thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else who would like to share something that you discussed in your breakout rooms? I know that there was a lot to talk about, and one of the nice things is if you choose to use this book and do perhaps a smaller book study with colleagues or with people in your local communities who are educators, using some of these questions and doing your own sort of book study maybe next year in the coming years, it's always a nice way to include more discussion around these topics because there's certainly a lot to talk about. The last thing that I wanted to do together tonight is consider some of the activities from these chapters that really resonated with all of you. And so we're going to do something similar for what we did last time. If you were in the session or if you watched it, there was a Padlet activity. This is actually the same Padlet that we used last time. I archived all of our previous responses into a PDF, and that PDF is linked into the resource document. So you can see all of what was shared in our last session together as a sort of archive and capture of everything that we talked about on the Padlet last time. And so to access today's Padlet, you can use that QR code that you see on the screen, or you can use this link that I'll put in the chat. And we're going to consider those various activities in chapters 4 and 5 that Nancy Hennessy has concluded. I counted around 34 different activities that she outlined. So there's certainly no, we're not lacking for activities that are evidence-based in these chapters. You're going to pick 1 or 2 activities that you'd like to try in your instruction or suggest to a colleague. Then you'll write down the name of that activity or activities in your post in the Padlet and a brief description of how you could see tailoring it or adapting it to fit the needs of your students or the needs of the teachers that you're working with. I'd love it if you included why you chose this activity, what might be different about this activity than other routines and strategies that you're already seeing in teachers' classrooms or that you're already using in your own instruction. And then if you have time, you can respond to other people's posts. We're going to spend 15 minutes doing this work, and then we'll begin wrapping up for tonight. Any questions about this activity? If you do, I'm here. I'm just putting the Padlet up so that we can see it on the screen, and let me know if you have any questions throughout this activity. But I'll start a timer for 15 minutes, and I'll give you a minute countdown when we are at that point. Yes, Erin, that's a great question. You do just hit that plus button in the bottom right hand, and you can title it with a subject if you'd like, or you can just click down where it says write something beautiful and just write whatever you'd like. If you have an artifact that you'd like to attach, you can certainly do that by clicking that link icon or the camera icon if you have a photo that you'd like to upload, or a document if you have something already in mind. A great question. about a minute and a half and finish up. Lots of great ideas and comments on that Padlet. I love all of your posts and your thoughts. So thank you so much for doing that. I think this is a really nice way to think about what we want to be more intentional about in the upcoming year with our students, and to capture that and sort of feed off one another's ideas and creativity. Saw that a few people had highlighted that simple routine, which I think is a great instructional strategy and technique for our students. As somebody said, I think Barbara mentioned earlier, Anita Archer has really great videos and instructional routines as examples for that simple routine. You Google her and go to her website. There's some great videos and resources that you find there. Also, if you're interested in a sentence expanding and combining, I think that the Writing Revolution, if you haven't already read it or looked into it, is a really great resource for both of those strategies. And Nancy Hennessy quotes Judith Hochman quite frequently in this chapter, and she's one of the authors along with Natalie Wexler for the Writing Revolution. And there's great templates and pieces that you can actually adapt on the Writing Revolution website if you've not already taken a peek on there. And so just a few extra resources that you might want to consider as you are implementing some of these in your planning and your instruction. There's some other resources I also wanted to share in this resource document that I shared last time. With each session, I'm just going to continue to add to it. And so on this resource document, I just dropped that link in the chat. You can take a look. And again, it's a live doc that I'll continue to add to. You can find all of those pieces that we briefly touched on last time. There's some more executive functioning resources for the end of session 1. And then session 2, there's a variety of different pieces that you might find helpful as well. So definitely a lot to look at in this document. Feel free to open it up and save it. And then as we continue, I'll continue to add more for sessions 3 and 4. But with that, are there any sort of last thoughts or questions or anything that you'd like to share as part of our wrap up for tonight? If you do think of anything, please let me know. I'm going to stay on, but I know that we are about 5 minutes from our end. So I wanted to say thank you so much to everybody who has stayed here tonight and who has joined both live and who's watched the recording. It's always fantastic to spend time with educators and talk about these ideas and these strategies and participate in this shared learning. So I always love doing this. Thank you so much for being a part. Our next session will be Wednesday, August 9th from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be focusing on chapters 6, 7, and 8. I do have a attendance form that I would love if you filled out. This will help me make sure that you are getting the appropriate credit for the time that you've spent in our Zoom sessions. So I'm going to drop that link in the chat. Feel free to open that up, complete it. You can stay signed in or you can log off to do that. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your evening and a wonderful rest of your week, wonderful rest of your day, depending on where you're joining from. If you have thoughts or questions, please feel free to stay on and I'm happy to talk through anything. Otherwise, complete the attendance form and have a great rest of your week. I'll see you on the 9th. Thanks so much.